absolute rubbish. Horrid, corrupt, disgraceful rubbish. You take a group of people and you give them every conceivable reason to be alienated, to be poor, to be sick, to be ignorant. Then you look down their nose, your nose at them and say, ah, they're a stupid bunch because they're black. And I say, that is the most vulgar, ignorant, contemptible attitude imaginable. What do the blacks of America, as he would call them, deserve? Well, I'm sure Jared Taylor, being a conservative, believes in inheritance rules. So let's see the inheritance which the present blacks have been denied. They have been denied the money they would have made as slaves properly paid. They have been denied all the monies that proper justice retribution would have given them when they were killed. They have been denied all the monies historically that would result from damages due to broken families, from the failure of the justice system to provide them with the minimum necessities, from the failure of the health system to provide them with health. That was denied 150, 200, 250 years ago. I want all that to be calculated, what they're owed, and I want it then to be compounded at interest, compound interest year by year. That is what Americans of his kind owe to the black community. No, it's not appropriate to look down your nose and think they're just stupid races, because we see through it, Jared. We see that what you are doing is trying to alienate yourself from a gigantic debt of inheritance, a gigantic failure on your part to find the true cause for human distress, and to walk away from it with your wealth and with your dignity, despite the fact that you've completely not described the real position, the real problem, which is a problem of poverty. So are there to be imagined any basis for optimism on the, with respect to racial diversity? Well, I think we could go through history and find a number of people have managed to pull themselves out of economic poverty. A number of cultures have passed from great poverty to great wealth over a long time. I think since the problem is one of economics and also one of failed retribution, in other words, Americans have not properly apologized to their black population, they have not given them financial and land reparations that are due to them. Failing all that, is there optimism? Well, the Americans could make the reparations. The Americans could give the apologies. The Americans could recognize that the problem is not race, but the fact that they have a large, visible minority which has been horribly abused by them, speaking of the whites, and that this visible minority is poor, not stuck in its racial groove, but rather denied all the opportunities of a good life. There is great optimism for our ability to resolve the problems of racial diversity. It is the optimism that is due to any intelligent human being, group of intelligent human beings, who can, if they're given an opportunity, become prosperous and happy. The benefit we would get from such a result? An enormous relief that we had somehow begun to atone for the sins of the past. We would have a large group of people who would no longer need welfare. We would have a huge group of people who would now join us in cultural projects of every kind as they're beginning to do so. Have we achieved that in Canada? Ah, we have. What Jared is reading to you, what Mr. Taylor is reading to you, shows our extreme sensitivity in Canada to racial issues. Have we in fact raised the level of the welfare of our racially diverse groups in Canada? Yes, we have. Would we benefit from greater raising of the integration and the value of education, etc.? Of course we would. A highly integrated, diverse society, as it is, would be a very beautiful place to live, and perhaps a little more interesting than one that was monocolor. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor March. Mr. Taylor, 10 minutes.
Certainly. I'm sure that the astute observer will have noticed that Professor March has not listed one strength that Canada or the United States gets from racial diversity. Not one. He's conceded, in fact, that there are problems. He says he hopes to overcome these problems. And when that happens, there will be a beautiful society of people profiting from each other's differences. I'd like to know where there is such a society. He has then gone on to tell us that the problem has nothing to do with race, that it's strictly a matter of poverty. He worked himself into a fine lather, in fact, on the subject of correlation and causation. Poverty, he tells us, causes it all. Well, let's talk a little bit about poverty. In the United States, people take causation and correlation quite seriously, and a number of studies have looked into the connection between crime and its various causes. If you correlate crime rates, if you control for poverty, if you control for lack of education, if you control for unemployment, you get hardly any difference from the crime rate association with race. It may be unfortunate, but that's the fact. Control for poverty, control for lack of education, control for joblessness. The most powerful correlation in the United States between crime is race. You can look to any neighborhood, and your best indicator is not poverty. It is not unemployment. It's not lack of education. The one best indicator is the percentage of blacks and Hispanics living in that neighborhood. Furthermore, if poverty were a cause of crime, do you remember that in the Depression, suddenly a huge number of people were poor who had not been poor before? Was there a surge in crime? Certainly not. People soldiered on. And the notion that somehow people are committing murder to feed their children, for heaven's sake, that's preposterous. People are committing murder for a host of reasons, to feed their crack cocaine habits, whatever it is. But poverty as a source of crime, on the contrary, crime causes poverty. If you have been a criminal all your life, been in and out of jail for the last 15 years, chances are you're going to have a hard time finding a job. If your neighborhood is full of crime, very few businesses will move there. Crime is more likely to cause poverty than the other way around. Now, Mr. March worked himself into yet another fine lather on the subject of the injustices done to blacks in the United States. Now, you could make the argument that all these injustices in effect prove my point, that racial diversity is a terribly difficult thing to handle. I would never argue that America has handled it particularly well. I would make the point that no country has handled it well. He has insisted that 100 to 50, 200, 250 years of oppression of blacks are the explanation of what we see today. I would like to know, why is it that in Canada and in Britain, which have nothing like the same history of oppression or slavery, lynching, Jim Crow, I know the litany as well as he does. Why is it that in those societies as well, blacks are essentially at the same place as they are in the United States, despite the fact that they have been present in large numbers for just a few decades? In Britain, for example, they keep statistics by race as well, and you'll find that in terms of poverty, violent crime, blacks once again are at the top of the list, bar none. And as I say, without any of the history that Professor March seems to glory in. Now, had Professor March really tried to take the bull by the horns and make an attempt to argue that diversity is strength, this is the sort of thing that he might have said. He might have said, for example, that diversity is very important in a world that's increasingly getting smaller. It'll help us in world trade. It'll help us understand the rest of the world. Well, I ask you, which are the most successful trading nations in the world today? China? Japan? These are not places that celebrate diversity. If you were to suggest to the Chinese, hey, fellas, you want to know how to boost your exports? Import a bunch of Puerto Ricans, or maybe Haitians, or maybe 1 million Pakistanis. Racial diversity, the Canadians love it, the Americans claim to love it. That will really boost things for you. They'd phone up for the men in white coats. They'd put you in a padded cell. They'd think you were nuts. They'd be right. The Japanese would take the same view. Also, there's this notion somehow that diversity will help us understand the world. Let me point out to you that the United States is more diverse today than it has been in any time in its history. And I would argue to you that this diverse United States is more hated than at any time in its history. And it's not simply because it was powerful, because it is powerful. Recall 1945. At that time, the United States was relatively more powerful vis-a-vis the rest of the world than it is today. Supremely powerful. It had just killed millions of people all around the globe, and yet it was a beloved country. It was also a country, by the way, that was racially homogeneous. But somehow the idea that if we have a few of these, a few of those, a couple of dozen of them living here that will somehow understand the world better, that we will be tuned in, doesn't seem to work for America, does it? No, as I say, we are more hated than ever. The other theory is that a diverse society on a college campus, for example, opens us up to different points of view. Well, in the United States and in Canada as well, the point of view, this illuminating point of view you're likely to get from students of color, is very much what Professor March, without being a person of color himself, has told us. This same litany of persecution, of oppression, chip on the shoulder. If you really wanted a diverse set of opinions from a college campus, you might try admitting an Afrikaner from South Africa. You might try admitting fundamentalist Christians, or race realists such as myself, or just a plain old conservative. Then you might get some dissent from the prevailing, mind-numbing orthodoxy of racial diversity. Once again, let me repeat, we have not heard one word from Professor March telling us what the advantages of it are, this racial diversity. He says, we want it, and somehow, if we can get it to work, it'll be so beautiful. Well, I'm hoping that in his next 10 minutes he will tell me where it has been gotten to work. Now, he spent a lot of time, as I said, in high dudgeon, telling us what wicked white people have done century after century. I'm not here to apportion blame. I do not claim that whites are sinless, nor would I take the view which he seems to take, that whites are somehow uniquely evil. Isn't that the impression you got from what you just heard? These wicked white people, look at what they've done, time after time, century after century, uniquely evil somehow. I'm saying that human beings are tribal. They have a natural preference for people like themselves. That is normal, it is healthy. Why build a society on the assumption that this must be overcome? Before it launched into its program of multiculturalism and multiracialism, Canada was an overwhelmingly white country. Why subject Canada to an unnecessary experiment? Why pose difficulties that may not be solvable to a people? The Canadian people never voted on this. They never said, why, yes, I grew up in Canada, but I'd like to grow old in Haiti. I grew up in Canada, but I'd like my children to live in an outpost of China. They never said that. And they never would if given a chance. The overwhelming majority of Canadians, in fact, say we've had enough immigration. But, no, they are to be made to live in this because of people like Professor March, who say it's got to be done. This is your destiny, and we've got to make it work. We're all going to be feeding on each other's differences. Well, I don't think that Canadians have somehow managed to suspend the laws of human nature. Human nature is the same everywhere. People are tribal. We can like it, we can not like it. But I believe that a society should be built on an assumption of reality, on an acceptance of the facts as they are, rather than as Professor March might wish they could be. It is folly to build a nation on the assumption that race can be made not to matter. No nation has achieved this. All the nations that are attempting it are failing. And so, Canadians and Americans alike, I urge you to rethink this notion that somehow this wonderful kumbaya future of all of us holding hands, all of us brothers under the skin, please set aside this fantasy and build a nation for your children and grandchildren that reflects the reality of human nature and not the fantasy of idealists like my distinguished opponent.